Hello, everyone. Hi, it's nice to see so many people here. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today's lecture. Mariam Hallie Davis is an associate professor of history at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Her recent book, Markets of Civilization, Islam and Racial Capitalism in Algeria, was just published by Duke University Press last September. And it's safe to say that it has already had a significant impact on the way we think about race and capitalism in Middle Eastern studies. Aside from her book, Professor Davis has published many articles on topics including the relationship between decolonization and territorial planning, the impact of US social sciences on French colonial developmentalism in Algeria, and the relationship between French colonialism in North Africa and European agricultural policies in the 1960s. And if you haven't done so already, I also encourage you to read her LA Review of Books essay on the reception of Fanon in American academia and its implications. It's really a powerful and necessary intervention, so you should read that. In a field dominated by scholars of Egypt and the Levant, North Africanists like us have to produce really exceptional work to remain part of the conversation on modern Middle Eastern history. And Professor Davis has certainly done so consistently, so it's really a pleasure to have her here. Her and I crossed paths several times over the last few years, but only got to sit down properly in Denver, of all places, during an academic conference. We ran into each other in the hotel lobby, desperately trying to find a way to watch Morocco's World Cup match. We were the only two people in the Sheraton downtown Denver trying to watch that match. And two very important things happened that day. Morocco won the match and went on to go to the semifinals of the World Cup. And Professor Davis accepted to come speak to us here. So it was a very important day. Her lecture is titled The Failures of Liberal Capitalism and the Racial Regime of Religion in Late Colonial Algeria. Please join me in welcoming her. I'll leave the mic.
Great, thank you all for being here. Thank you for that introduction. I also am getting to escape the atmospheric rivers that California is having right now. This is a term I learned this year, so it's lovely to be back in New York. And I usually teach at 8 a.m., so this is also the most awake and well-fed crowd I've gotten to speak to in quite some time. So thanks again for the invitation to be here. I do want to take the theme of this speaker series seriously. So I am going to structure my remarks around failures I've encountered in terms of the historiography, failures that my historical actors were worried about, and perhaps the relevance and emancipatory potential of these failures. So my book is organized around the Constantine Plan, which is a plan for social and economic development that was introduced by Charles de Gaulle in 1958. So in the middle of the War of Independence, or the Algerian Revolution, de Gaulle proclaims, "An economist will fix this for me," just to show you how much confidence he had in these technocratic planners. And he then puts into place this incredibly ambitious plan. And so rather than getting into the crux of my book's argument, I'm going to start by talking about the Constantine Plan as failure. So when I started my dissertation research, which was much more focused on the Constantine Plan than the book is, there was nothing to say about the Constantine Plan. The historiography told me it had been a plan introduced to keep Algeria French, that it had been an attempt to win the local population over to French sovereignty during the war, and that it failed, and that the case was closed, and that this was a kind of older vein of scholarship that really didn't merit a dissertation. And indeed, there had been some historiographical discussions in France in the early 1990s. Daniel Lefebvre wrote a book, and later a book chapter entitled The Failure of the Constantine Plan. And he said, first of all, that this was a plan introduced during the Guerre d'Algérie. So he used the term Algerian War, which is also telling in my field, where there are big debates about what do we call these years of violence. Is it the Algerian War, the War of Liberation, the Algerian Revolution? So already he's starting with the Guerre d'Algérie. And he goes on to offer a balance sheet of the stated goals of industrialization, that is what the plan promised in terms of factories, in terms of economic variables that could be measured, and then the end result. And he says, the gap shows us that this plan was a failure. And he does it to make us understand one thing in particular, which is that the Marxist historiography was wrong. In other words, Lefebvre wanted to show that the interests of metropolitan capital were not tied to colonization, but rather compatible with independence. So he has a very clear rendering of economic history that he is ascribing to when he proclaims that the plan was a failure. A couple of years later, there had been polemics in France after the 2005 attempt to introduce a law about the positive effects of colonialism. And Daniel Lefebvre then went back, revisited these arguments about the failure of the plan to show that indeed empire had been not profitable for France, but rather a burden, right? So the afterlives of thinking about the Constantine Plan and its failure ended up being fodder for an argument regarding France's legacy as a colonizing power, right? And Lefebvre wrote a book that wanted to speak against the tendency for repentance. So he was arguing against a new generation of scholars that, as he saw it, were overly repentant for French colonialism. So again, putting my thoughts together for today, I was fascinated by how the declaration of failure of an economic plan could then dovetail with a political program and rewriting of French colonialism from the alleged neutrality of economic history. In doing so, I would argue he also sanitized colonial history in a way that dovetailed with certain neoliberal discourses that were gaining purchase in the early 1990s. And I'll probably come back to this a little bit later in the talk. So I was fascinated by these declarations of failure of the Constantine Plan, that it was too little too late, that it didn't hit the required benchmarks, or that it was too costly for the French state. And for me, this seemed like a strange way to go about studying an economic plan. I was trained as a Foucaultian, and I wanted to know what assumptions about market economies or about human nature were built into the plan. That is, rather than looking at the results or doing a kind of cost-benefit analysis, what would it mean to take the plan seriously and the way these planners envisioned Algerian Muslims and their capacities for market society? So on the one hand, there's this historiographic declaration of failure that meant that the Constantine Plan was profoundly uninteresting for everybody around me, except for myself. So often, especially in France, I would tell colleagues, that I'm, what are you working on? And you come up with your elevator pitch. And my elevator pitch was the Constantine Plan. And I would get this kind of like devastatingly bored look that, that's been done. And often people assume that what I wanted to do was find more empirical detail, that what I wanted to do was, find the amount of cotton industrialists versus wool industrialists or something like that. So explaining this project was difficult precisely because the historiography had presented it as a failure. And there's something also interesting about presenting it as a failure, which is that the achievement of revolutionary change, here defined by national sovereignty, was the mark of the failure. So the assumption was scripted from the perspective of French Empire, right? The plan failed because Algeria won independence. And so even the vocabulary of failure showed me something about the ways that the loss of empire still structured the historiography. And if it wasn't about failure, sometimes you would hear things about, in a more kind of liberal vein, about les occasions manquées, right? The missed opportunities that still structured many of these debates. So that was one, that's my first case study in failure, as it were. And in some ways, it's strange to talk about failure when I work on the Algerian Revolution, which has been seen as a kind of utopian success in many ways. And I think a lot of my comments today are trying to go back and forth between these utopian aspirations and the discourses of failure or almost failure that surrounded my research. So to move on to another moment, despite all the utopian hopes associated with the Algerian Revolution, even on the one hand, you had travelers, fellow travelers and comrades from France who came to Algeria to help Ben Bella set up a socialist state after 1962. And you also had comrades from the Mashriq, particularly from Lebanon and Syria, who are looking to Algeria with a great deal of hope, seeing it as a model of pan-Arabism. Neither of these groups, I would say, identified the revolution as a failure, but they both had profound misgivings about the potential for failure, about the threat of failure. So the second moment I'd like to talk about comes from the Mashriq, where intellectuals on the left were watching the Algerian Revolution closely in the late 1950s, but they were also debating the nature of anti-colonial revolt. And of course, the 1950s are a very important moment for pan-Arabism, trying to articulate what that means, especially after 1955 and what has been called the Arab Cold War. So, right, trying to figure out what is pan-Arabism and how does the Maghreb fit into it is not an obvious question, writing at this time. So here, I'm jumping a bit to another chapter of the book. In 1956, the Egyptian historian Ali al-Shalqani publishes Thawrat al-Jazair, the Algerian Revolution, which viewed the French occupation, not an inherent Arab spirit, as the essential catalyst for the emergence of Algerian nationalism. In this work, he also highlights the role of Islam in providing a link between Arab and tribal consciousness, and argues that French colonialism organized racial difference along religious lines. So he's writing this in 1956. Fascinatingly, or I hope fascinatingly, because it's a big chunk of the book, the Palestinian critic Naji Alouche publishes a searing critique of Shalqani in the leftist Lebanese journal Al-Adab. So, part of what I was fascinated by were the figure of a Palestinian and Egyptian intellectual fighting over the content of the Algerian Revolution and how they're understanding what the revolutionary potential is and on what basis Algerian nationalism has been articulated. So Alouche offers a different genealogy of Algerian nationalism. He claims that Algeria had been an organic part of the Arab body since the 7th century, that is the invasion of North Africa by Muslims from the East, and drew a parallel between the anti-colonial movement of Abdel Qadir and the Algerian Revolution that began in 1954. He also rejected al-Shalqani's portrayal of Algerian nationalism, and he also rejected the class analysis of Algerian society. Instead, he emphasized the great harmony of all factions of the people. And in his eyes, the major force for integration among the Algerian population was the Arabic language and not religion. He wrote, "The French did not wage war against the Algerians because they were Muslim, as al-Shalqani claims, but because they are part of an Arab civilization with humanistic values and a strong hold of Arabism, or al-Aruba." So once again, there's a clash about what the content, the positive content of Algerian nationalism is. Is this about Islam or is this about Arabism or Arabness? And what has been the role of French colonialism in structuring this? Al-Shalqani's original assertion that there was something distinctive about the Algerian Revolution because of the extreme violence of the French occupation and the particular divide and rule policies introduced by the French, it ended up being very controversial. So as I've tried to hint at here, the difference in interpretation exposed the cracks in pan-Arabism between the Mashriq and the Maghreb, which could also be seen elsewhere in the region. So as historians like Ahmed Halawani demonstrate, in the Syrian press, across the ideological spectrum, people reported on the Algerian Revolution, excuse me, in the context of the greater Arab homeland, or qawm or qawmiya, rather than the more territorial notion of wataniya. And this kind of deterritorialized nationalism was less salient than notions of the watan in Algeria, I and others have argued. In Algeria, where the war had been fought for an independent nation state, rather than for Algeria to be dissolved into some greater entity. But more romantic renditions were plentiful. A 1962 publication from Iraq presented Algeria as part of the Arab Ummah, tied to the region by blood, civilization. And this kind of discourse was common in Ba'athist circles, and even as early as 1956, some of the essential questions regarding pan-Arabism were being worked out over interpretations of the Algerian Revolution. So as an aside here, the prompt for this lecture series invited us to think about how failure could also have some emancipatory potential. So this is a kind of aside to the scholarly point I just made, because this section of the book was very difficult for me to write. So in chapter 5, I get into this critique of some Ba'athist visions of Algeria and push back a little bit about the imposition of Arabness on the Maghreb. And I'm not Arab, but I do have some affective attachments to pan-Arabism, like many people who have grown up at a certain political moment. And so I called a colleague and said, am I allowed to do this? Am I allowed to make this critique of pan-Arabism at a moment when, there's another strand of scholarship happening right now that I find fascinating, that looks at the Arab left, that tries to resurrect some of these projects, and does so, I think, for, really laudable political reasons as a kind of a touchstone of hope, perhaps. And so when I called her and I'm expressing these worries, and she says, she kind of gave me license to publish the chapter. And the question she asked me was, what were my investments in an emancipatory horizon, and why did I want to keep fostering it if I could already see that it had been overdetermined in some ways? So, why did I feel that I had to protect certain kinds of success, even when I was telling a different story? And so, even if these essentializing discourses were strategic, and I, understand why as a scholar, the notion of introducing the prospect of failure into that was a difficult thing for me to do as a leftist. I teach at UCSC, so we are allowed to say things like as a leftist pretty openly. I'm gonna have to reintegrate into my East Coast self, but so in writing the book, I had to grapple historically and politically with the relationship between Algeria and these broader currents of pan-Arabism, especially since it meant a good deal to me to do this work and to read these sources in Arabic, which most people have ignored. And I think it was revelatory in that I prefer not to think about it as failure or lack or deficit, but rather overdetermination, right? That there was something overdetermined about the discourse of pan-Arabism, the way it was being applied to the Maghreb and Algeria in particular. Okay, so that's my second moment of failure. This feels like I'm doing penance for, I don't know, a class gone wrong or something, that my 3 moments of failure, but there is one more. And this is a moment of failure that I observed through the eyes of historical actors after independence. So after 1962, Algerian President Ahmed Ben Bella is actually building off of the Constantine Plan. So there's actually a lot of continuity between 62 and what came before it, which is one of the claims I make in my book. And he wants to introduce an authentically Algerian socialism rooted in Islam, right? That is the policy. And you might have read things about self-management or autogestion under Ben Bella. So these early years often go understudied I would say, even amidst the kind of flurry of works that look at Algeria as a mecca of revolutions and often are looking at a later period. And I'm really focused in the 1962 to 1965 period before the Boumediene coup. During this period, Trotskyists and anarchists from all over the world, but especially from France, pour into Algeria, not to be coopérant, not to participate in the French official reconstruction of the country and development efforts, but to be part of Ben Bella's inner circle. So Michel Raptis, or Pablo, helps write the March Decrees, which is the text responsible for land reform. And Algeria becomes the hope of a new international possibility for revolution. So these individuals are known as the Pieds Rouges, or the Red Feet, in contradistinction to the Black Feet, or the Pieds Noirs, who were the settlers who had come from different places in Europe over the course of the 19th century. So I'm going to tell a little anecdote from the book here. In March 1964, the French anarchist Daniel Guérin arrived in Algiers with a personal invitation from Ben Bella to attend the Conference for Industrial Self-Management. Like many with communist sympathies who arrived after independence, Guérin had been a staunch opponent of French repression during the Algerian War of Independence. During his visit to the capital, he observed street signs, and these street signs presented cleanliness as a symbol of Islam. They exemplified Ben Bella's attempts, I would argue, to promote civic virtues through religion. But Guérin wondered if it was really necessary to invoke Islam to encourage hygiene. Certain leftists had viewed these appeals to religion as a direct response to the deracination that occurred under colonialism, but Guérin disagreed. Instead, he maintained that the Algerian state was using Islam to calm a volatile population at a moment of extreme political tension. So on this point, he also broke with some of his Trotskyist comrades, such as Pablo, the leader of the Fourth International. While those around Pablo, sometimes called Pablistes, which I just think is a funny name, the Pablistes, regarded religion as a superstructure that would be transformed by changes in the economic base. So they held out hope that if the revolution were to take place in the realm of the economy, the superstructure would also then would then get rid of religion and this kind of fuzzy Islamic socialism that was in the air. But Guérin insisted that revolution was a totality. He thus contested Ben Bella's vision of a specifically Algerian socialism rooted in Islam, and he writes that, quote, "No revolutionary socialism can be established on a religious basis." So among the far left kind of anti-clerical actors that come to Algeria, many of them feel that they are sacrificing their political principles by defending Ben Bella, that they are sacrificing the importance of anti-clericalism to their own notion of what it means to be revolutionary by contributing to the construction of this vaguely Islamic socialist state. So Guy Debord writes to Guérin and denounces his support for the Algerian president. For the situationalist Debord, Ben Bella could not be considered an enlightened despot, and instead he characterizes the Algerian president as a second-rate or poor copy of Robespierre, right? So again, the best you can do in thinking about Ben Bella and the Algerian Revolution in light of the real revolution, the French Revolution, is to say that Ben Bella is a poor second copy of the original. So there's also a sense of derivative versus core revolutions here, and the notion that can a society that's still using Islamic symbols even pretend to be a revolutionary force? And this really troubles many people on the left. And I think there are many things to say about the left in France today and the way that they have trouble thinking about Islam, leftism, and class and Islamophobia together. I'd be happy to talk about that in the Q&A. So in September of 1964, Pablo also reflected on the role of the Arab Islamic tradition in Algeria's socialist experiment. He conceded that it did offer a certain character, but expressed discomfort with the idea that Islam had fashioned a source of resistance against colonization. Instead, he placed the accent on Algerians' material grievances. He wrote, "Sure, one should raise the question of religion in a flexible way before a profound transformation of the country attenuates the current importance of this factor. One would nevertheless be exaggerating to explain the cohesion and resistance of the Algerian Revolution by religion, rather than by the effects of secular colonization and the war, and by the common revolutionary aspirations, particularly the desire felt by the large majority of Algerians to recover their land." So again, you get the sense that there's a profound dis-ease with how to understand the religious language in which some of these claims are being made. And for Pablo, who is certainly more open than many, it can be seen as a kind of false consciousness that then expresses the real issue, which was the dispossession in terms of land and resources. But he did hope that with time, as the country gained experience, it would evolve towards a genuine revolution, an anti-clerical revolution. So in this sense, the Algerian Revolution was a derivative version of the French Revolution, and one that had failed to embrace the anti-clericalism that was so dear to this particular group of leftists who had, taken on significant risk in going to Algeria and being part of Ben Bella's inner circle. So my hope is, in putting together these moments of failure, that they all tell us something about how historians, as well as how revolutionary actors at the time, understood the Algerian Revolution. As I argue in my book, all of these interpretations, whether it's the failure of the Constantine Plan, the overdetermination of pan-Arabism, or the Pieds Rouges' disillusionment with Ben Bella's Islamic socialism, they all hinge on a set of blind spots regarding the colonial relationship between Islam and the economy, or the ways in which the French state had constructed what I call a racial regime of religion around Islam during the colonial period. And so this had important implications, not only for the role of the Constantine Plan and what I think these planners were trying to do in introducing this set of reforms, but also the political language of revolution adopted by the Algerian state after 1962, which I would argue was reducible neither to French anti-clerical models nor to pan-Arabism. Okay, so I want to move on here and just give you a little bit about what the book's actually, what it does and what it's about. I've started with the problem before coming to what I hope is a part of the solution. So the central argument of the book is that rather than declaring that the Constantine Plan or late colonial development in general was a failure because it did not stop the Algerian Revolution, it did not stop Algerian sovereignty, that we should look at how assumptions about Algerian Muslims were embedded in the plan itself. That is, we can use the plan to tell us something about how the French state, a set of economists, politicians, and ethnologists are looking at Muslim behavior and economic markets. And so my chapters, the bulk of the chapters in the middle of the book, study how concrete economic reforms were introduced and the assumption that they all shared, which was that homo Islamicus, so this model of the Orientalist fantasy of short-sightedness, embodied in the individual who was inherently resistant to market economies and did not have the aptitudes necessary to navigate liberal economic markets, that figure was inherently in tension with homo economicus, right? The fantasy of the usually male profit-maximizing individual. And in Algeria, the French settler colony was built around Islam as the element that determined exclusion from French citizenship and by extension, the economic benefits that came with it. So the structuring grammar of the book are these two figures of homo Islamicus on the one hand as a trope, and homo economicus on the other hand. That was supposed to be the title of the book. Would have been a terrible title. So thank you to my editor for alerting me to the fact that neither homo Islamicus or homo economicus roll off the tongue in a saleable manner. So just to offer a bit of historical background for non-Maghreb people, the Algerian territory becomes 3 French departments in 1848, but this does not mean that all of the inhabitants in that territory become full French citizens. One of the most important laws to govern the settler colony is the 1865 Senatus Consult, which affirms that Algerian Muslims were French nationals, but not French citizens. So they did not have the full rights of citizens, even if they were incorporated into France as nationals. So according to this law, both the indigènes israélites, so indigenous Jews, and indigènes musulmans, indigenous Muslims, were governed by their respective personal status laws, and therefore could not be subjected to the French civil code. So this is, the first moment at which we see a legal apparatus that distinguishes native Muslims and native Jews based on personal status laws. So you start to see, I would argue with this, the transformation of Islam into a marker of racial difference, but its full force is only felt after both Algerian Jews and then Europeans were granted full citizenship in 1870 and 1889, respectively. So over the course of the 19th century, it is Islam that becomes the marker for exclusion, whereas indigenous Jews achieve citizenship en bloc, and people from Malta, Spain, Italy, who had been living in Algeria, are also made French. So the dichotomy or binary that is so characteristic of a settler colony occurs through these legal means, and it does so in a way that does not have to do with skin color, but rather through religion. And to be really clear here, my planners and these jurists are not interested with how people feel. Like they don't care if people are fasting, if they are, if they're saying salat. This is not what they're worried about. It's a legal apparatus that's a state category rather than, a kind of self-envisioned category. And indeed, even conversion couldn't really get you out of this. So when Algerian Muslims converted to Catholicism, and they still didn't have French citizenship, you see the kind of wild phrase, indigènes musulmans catholiques, right? So the musulman, even though they've converted, stays there as the marker of indigeneity, despite the fact that this is no longer a religious category for these individuals. So, based on this history, one of the things the book tries to do is grapple with how scholars working outside the Atlantic world might read and work through the insights of the Black radical tradition in a context where, again, it's religion and not skin color that was the marker of difference, and the racial project of settler colonialism has its own specificities. So it's less about applying a model that comes from elsewhere and rather trying to think with and through the history of Algeria to provide some new theoretical tools. So I don't want to be read as importing yet another model that comes from American theory and putting it in the Middle East or North Africa. I more want to go back to the older tradition of thinking with Algeria as a place of theory making. So I hope that offers a glimpse of the ways I'm framing racial capitalism in the book. And my argument is not merely that colonial capitalism targeted Algerians as subjects who would then be dispossessed more violently than Europeans. I think that it goes without saying and is pretty obvious. But I'm hoping the book shows how the very language of liberal political economy, which sees cultural aptitudes and capacities as central to economic success after World War II, but also before, should be understood as a form of racial knowledge. So that is to say that the discipline of economic planning La planification économique, which in the French context of the post-war period has a very specific genealogy, was a kind of condensation point where racial thought was marshaled to craft specific policies regarding the construction of markets, the functioning of credit, the standardization of agriculture, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a lot of moments in the book where I spend pages and pages about how wine or olive oil were standardized. I don't think that makes for a wonderful talk, but again, the assumptions that come with crafting markets are not just about economic rationalities. They are taking into account the imagined capacities and aptitudes of Algerian Muslims as such, even at a moment where the French state is trying to perform a certain kind of colorblindness, right? So after the Constitution of 1946, there has to be a new way of thinking about racial difference. And part and parcel of that attempt to instantiate a more culturalist racism, I would argue, comes through a language of the economy. I'm going to try to bring it back to failure. I promised I was going to do this, so it might be a little bit forced at times, but I take these assignments seriously. One of the things that helped me think through this project was Foucault's writings on neoliberalism, where he notes that neoliberalism tends to think about failure not as a blockage of economic mechanisms, but rather an insufficient investment in human capital. So that the staging of failure allows this category of human capital to become operative. And I think it's interesting how postmortems of things that have failed get to then birth new categories, whether that's in economic planning or in the social sciences. Similarly, I'm interested in how declarations of failure also allow for hegemonic explanations that then neutralize or invisibilize other kinds of epistemologies that were at work. So looking at my research, time and time again, when initiatives seem to have failed, when they did not give the results that the planners desired, planners didn't question the central assumptions of their policies. They didn't question the structural racism on which the colony had been built. Instead, they upheld these failures as proof that Algerian Muslims could not understand market economies, that they did not have the necessary initiative, that they were not hardwired to be able to project into the future, for example. So the staging of failure is a very important political moment in being able to rehearse and even update received knowledge about the ways that Muslims interact with the economy in Algeria. In so doing, they also allied the historical structures of settler colonialism through which economic dispossession worked through religious and racial categories. So these moments of failure, I think, are foundational for allowing the dichotomy between homo Islamicus and homo economicus to be affirmed and reestablished, right? They're moments where these achieve new purchase. So I'm not exactly sure how I'm doing on time. 5-10 minutes. But I think that had historians not been so tempted by the seduction of failure and the loss of French Algeria, they might have asked a different set of questions about the Constantine Plan. And indeed, those questions, what really strikes me now looking back, the book is done, at my sources and at the book, is that I didn't have to dig very deep to find them. So de Gaulle himself says the Constantine Plan will bring into being a new man in Algeria. So the social engineering is, declared by de Gaulle himself. And Jean Vibert, who is one of, I now have favorite technocrats. He's one of my favorite technocrats. And he says the following in 1961. Thanks to the Constantine Plan, Homo economicus has been born. He has replaced Homo Islamicus, who accepted an extremely low level of material needs and who, as a result, did not feel the need to work more than was necessary. He is slowly becoming Homo economicus, who is driven by his needs, just like his European counterpart, and who consequently starts working and is concerned with the betterment of his output and bonuses and with improving his skills, and has the underlying yet profound desire to uplift his children and the next generation. So again, this is a quote that I'm sure historians have read many times who've worked on this, but the seduction of failure, I think, was too strong to take these terms seriously. So one of the more surprising arguments, or perhaps controversial arguments in the book, is how this grammar doesn't disappear in 1962. Revolutions, we're often told in the writings of Fanon or elsewhere, is a kind of year zero, a wiping clean, a starting over from nothing. But of course, as social scientists and historians, we know that racial formations cannot just be erased or undone, and that structures of power and articulations between race and language, or among race, language, and nationalism are thicker than that. And so in the book, I argue that Ben Bella turned colonial ideology on its head, but he did not undo the fundamental connection between Islam as a set of behaviors or capacities and an economic system. So he continued to assert that there was something fundamental about Islam. It wasn't that it was going to be hostile to open markets or liberal capitalism, but it was inevitably, inherently, essentially going to be the motor nerve of socialism. So there's still an assumption that Islamic behaviors and economic organization have a kind of one-to-one logic. So Amar Ouazzane, the Minister of Agriculture, for example, said this, and this is another one of my favorite quotes. Al-baraka fil haraka, there is benediction in movement. The Algerian masses, who were previously prisoners of fatalism and superstition, are not only developing a collective will and a force of energy, but an authority that will replace the destructible colonial power. Islam is not a backward hereditary defect, nor an ideological obstacle that is stuck in the superstructure, but a motor nerve that is as necessary for the revolution as the other determinant elements of the infrastructure, right? So again, you can see he's taking the notion of Islam as backwards for the economy and flipping it on its head. And this was not just at the level of discourse. In 1963, the Nationality Code also makes citizenship contingent on paternal filiation and French personal status law. So to obtain Algerian nationality, it was necessary for the father of an individual to have been born in Algeria and governed by Islamic legal codes during colonial rule. So one reason that I think Algeria was difficult to assimilate to a particular tradition of pan-Arabism was the fact that Islam, rather than Arabism or Arabness, was the cement of national belonging. And so this too, I would say, is a function of the racial regime of religion that rendered Algeria a success in the eyes of the Arab world, but only recognizable in a slightly different historical set of terms, which would be pan-Arabism. And similarly, this question about the success or failure of Algeria's revolution, and I had mentioned the kind of far left in the 1960s, but this also has continuing relevance, I would argue. This past summer, when Algeria was celebrating its 60th anniversary, the questions in the media were systematically, had Algerian independence succeeded? Had it been a success? And so what do you make of this kind of completely, how do you answer this totally reductive trope, right? And, jokes about like France 24 aside, which are easy to make, there was a journalistic hegemony that everybody was asking this question to whatever guests they had in front of them. And, it would be unimaginable to pose this question about success and failure to the French Revolution, for example. So again, the notion of failure is something that is kind of haunts current visions of the Algerian Revolution, and especially with the Hirak and the way that the Hirak, would call for istiqlal. And I don't know if we want to talk about that or not, probably not, since this is recorded and I want a visa. But that's here nor there. And other ways in which I think this kind of failure remains with us politically are questions of Islamo-gauchism in France and the inability to think about Islam and racism together, precisely because religion is something you choose, you convert, and race is something that is quote unquote biological. There is still this notion that it's impossible to think about religion and Islam. There was somebody on the far left a few years ago who argued for the right to be Islamophobic, right? I mean, in the public space. So that's pretty wild. So to conclude, I think one way of understanding racial capitalism is that it's an aberration from the smooth runnings of actual capitalism. That racial capitalism is one instantiation of capitalism where the violence is made so clear that it devolves into something else, right? So that there's a failure that makes capitalism interracial capitalism. But I actually think here I've hopefully tried to offer a bit of a different narrative, and to say that the moment of stated failure, so here maybe decolonization, where clearly there is something that is going wrong with the colonial system, tells us about the more mundane operations. And I think that fits into my understanding of racial capitalism, not as a different kind of capitalism in crisis, but as a indication of the ways that capitalism needs to think about human difference for accumulation and value. So perhaps framed in this way, going back to the Constantine Plan, it's not that the reforms failed, but they made manifest a colonial grammar that indeed had been their starting point, this division between homo Islamicus and homo economicus. So I'm going to end there, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. I have many questions, but I won't abuse my powers as moderator just yet. So I'll just open it up. And if you have a question, please go ahead.
Professor Davis, thank you so much for your talk. My name is Nancy. I'm a PhD student here at Columbia in the history department, ocean historian, and also work on racial capitalism from the Mediterranean. So there's so many fabulous things about this book that I'm so excited about. But I wanted to focus on two. One of them is that, of course, this question of the sort of religion, race, capitalism matrix is not one unique to Islam, and indeed is, one of the central questions within Jewish studies, right? And I was immediately, one of the books that I've thought about a lot alongside yours is Leora Halpern's recent work on settler colonialism and capitalism in the Yishuv and thereafter. And one of the things that strikes me when we think about the sort of quote unquote Jewish and Muslim questions together is that there is a very long tradition of Marxist critique that, so I mean, in a way, what Leora is doing is very similar to what you're doing in that she's identifying how, from the opposite end, how Jewishness became the basis for racial settler colonial exclusion in a way that disavowed, capitalism, right? So the Yishuv was socialist, ostensibly, and democratic, ostensibly, but in fact depended upon Jewish supremacy that itself was able to sort of let's say, monopolize capital and property within Palestine, right? But there's a whole other tradition of scholarship on anti-Semitism specifically that says it's not that race is about just segregation, right? Or unequal pay scales or property dispossession per se, but that there's something else about race that is a bit more elusive, which is that race is also a fetish. And so one reason why anti-Semitism is so persistent is because in the modern world is because it is the personification, right, of the figure of the sort of negative effects of capitalism. I'm thinking about Moshe Postone's tradition, right? And so what's striking there is that, by the time period that you're talking about, the personification of the negative effects of capitalism seems to affect not so much to the figure of the Jew, but to the figure of the sort of Chinese or Asian laborer, right? And so I wonder about the kind of ghost of, and I think Yusuf knows I was going to ask this question, but I wonder about the ghost of Asian racialization in the story that you tell, and what it might mean to think about Muslim racialization also as a form of personification, given that by this time period, by the 60s, by the 70s, by the 80s, certainly, in much of the Anglo-speaking world, the Asian laborer is seen in a way as idealized, right, as a kind of model minority laborer. To what extent is the Muslim or even Arab figure begun to be fetishized as a failed figure in relation to the Asian laborer, right? And I think about this particularly because it seems strange to talk about Cold War colorblindness and not think about the role of American institutions post-56 and the Suez Crisis, of American institutions in the creation of global colorblindness, you know, the Mutual Defense Assistance Program that Simeon Mann has written about, and so on and so forth. So in short, what is the relationship of Muslim racialization to Asian racialization in this Cold War era, where Asian racialization plays such a huge role in how people perceive certain subjects as successful economic subjects and others not? I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you for that really rich question. And absolutely, you know, one of the figures that I found helpful to think with was the specter of Judeo-Bolshevism as well in the book. So I do think that these phenomenon are relational, and indeed, the question of how to put this story in conversation with or the racialization of Asian labor is a tricky one, because I stop in 1965 in Algeria. The US is trying to get a foothold in 1962 and not doing so well. So it's more East Europe. France is still in the game. There are some Quakers coming through, but the kind of a developmental apparatus has not shifted to the US yet. And so that's not something that is playing out on the ground. Which is not to say that in broader understandings of a labor market in France, this wouldn't be an important question, right? So, for example, the way that the Berber myth gets retaken up so that they're the better workers in France, and the ways that Belgian mines, for example, have a very racialized idea of who are going to be the good workers and who are not. But in the context of Algeria, that's not yet a relationality that is pressing upon planners that I'm working on. But the point is very well taken. And I guess I would say, I forget the word you used, a fetish, I think was the word you used. I mean, for me, I see it as a foil, right? That Muslims and Jews serve as a foil to the correct, going back to even, liberal philosophies, like going back to who is the subject who possesses himself and therefore has the right to possess land. The foil, especially in the late 18th century, is the Turk and the despot, and that's very present in kind of the way Orientalism is playing out in a certain kind of liberal philosophical tradition. So for me, I think of it more of a foil. And even, Marx, we know what he's written on the Jewish question. When he gets to Algeria, he also has, kind of interesting things to say about what he finds in Algeria that does not dovetail very well with the actual land tenure arrangements. So there's certainly projection and foils. I don't know that he's fetishizing, other than being called a Moor, I don't see a fetishization so much as a frustration that these people that he sees around him cannot get a real revolution together. And that's kind of what he says in his letters to Engels when he's, trying to cure himself for pleurisy in Algiers at the end of his life. So I think it's a really interesting question about how to do a more relational account of the ways that racial capitalism is operating. One of the things I tried to do in this book for better or for worse, was to be really specific and to think about the racial formation of the settler colony, to not say Islam is racialized everywhere, because I wanted to show the intricacies of this case study. And I'm also uncomfortable with kind of taking this story and extrapolating it everywhere. Doesn't make sense to me because of, like I said, the legal edifice is so specific to Algeria. So I guess long response, but I hope that I've given some tools, and I would love to see that kind of work happen. I just didn't feel like I wanted to bring it back to one racial project. But of course, racial projects are always relational and in conversation with other ones. And certainly my plan, I've got to stop calling them my planners. Talk about effective attachments. The planners that I study are very much looking at Israel, and they're very much also looking at the US at an earlier moment, right? So I've written a little bit about this for Merit in a short piece, but there is a triangulation of figuring out different modes of settler colonies, particularly around citrus, red citrus farming. So anyways, thank you for that question.
But I guess my quick follow-up is exactly on this question of specificity, right?
Yeah.
Because one of the things I love about your book is that you're taking the theorists, these activists, seriously. And what strikes me is that the kind of discourse happening, let's say in Egypt at the time, on the part of British colonialists, is exactly the opposite. It's that that homo Islamicus, in a way, is homo economicus, right? That, I mean, thinking of Aaron's work, yeah. Right? That the Egyptian laborers aren't capable of thinking but in terms of their economic interests. So do you see that as part of the same hermeneutic world, in the sense that the problem is precisely thinking about the world in terms of Islam versus the material? Or do you see that as a distinction between British economic thinkers, classical political economists, let's call them, versus French classical political economists and liberals?
Yeah, I've had this out with Aaron. I mean, he's a friend and comrade, and we were trained together. And I think, on the one hand, for thinking about the British and Egypt, the Fallah, I think there's a lot in common there, and Tim Mitchell's work on the racialization of the Fallah. So there I see a rural sociology world that is doing similar things. In terms of the political economy, and even the kinds of social utopian fantasies, I think it's very different. I think the French Orientalist kind of sociology of religion lens through which the people I study are working is different, is a different tradition. And it would be interesting to actually sit down with Aaron and try to write this out a little bit, because we have, it's very friendly, but I do think it's interesting to see the specificity, even in terms of economic policies of France, and it's quite different than what's happening in Britain. So I do think there's a different genealogy there.
Thanks, Professor Davis, for your presentation. My name is Ahmed Mitish. We met, if you remember, the MESA conference a few years ago. I'm a PhD student now here in anthropology. And I had two questions. When you talk about the sort of the racial formation of capitalism, I was wondering how you're thinking about older religious formations, Ottoman, earlier colonial identifications with religion, and how this religious identification, you mentioned Ben Bella's sort of Islamic socialism, but also by other actors like the Jamiat al-Ulama, for example, who are thinking about these things, and how that relates perhaps to the colonial imposition of these racial religious formations. And then can I ask a second sort of unrelated question? When you were talking about sort of this idea of homo Islamicus, I was reminded of the essay by Bourdieu, and he talks about the Algerian peasant towards time. And obviously this notion of homo Islamicus has to do with temporality. There is this idea of the not being able to see into the future, et cetera. So yeah, I guess I was just wondering if you could sort of maybe comment on this idea of temporality. I'm actually doing my qualifying exams right now. My advisor's right there, so I hope this doesn't count as cheating. most importantly, I hope this doesn't count as cheating. Yeah.
Thank you for coming. Oh yeah, yeah, you guys get fed here, so that's yeah. So I'll start with the Bourdieu question because it's one that that troubles me, because so much of my thinking in grad school was Bourdieusian. You know, I kind of like loved Bourdieu. I was one of those people. I was that annoying person in seminar who was always bringing up Bourdieu, right? But going back to those works now. You know, so the French technocrats who have a plan of remaking Algerian peasants into market subjects are frustrated because they say the peasant is inherently resistant to the market, and that's bad. And Bourdieu kind of does a flip thing where he says the peasant is inherently resistant to the market, and that's good, right? He kind of romanticizes the peasants, you know, that they won't buy olive oil on the market because that's something that's too morally outside of their purview. And so one of the things in the book that I try to do is show that there are disagreements even among kind of the liberal technocrats and the army planners, the sociologists like Bourdieu, but there is still a shared assumption that there is an interiority or essential subjectivity to the Algerian peasant that's based on Islam. And Bourdieu just is happy about it because he sees it as a bastion against capitalism, right? He's writing from a different political agenda. So I think, you know, the temporality thing is interesting because in trying to get people to understand what a loan is, for example, that becomes really complicated. They're giving money to the fallah, and the fallahin are like, oh great, you're just giving us money, right? But it's very important to the planners. For the planners, it's not about like take the money and go plant some things for your family. It's about take the money, use it, make yourself into an entrepreneurial subject. So they're not interested in kind of aid in a, you know, pre-World War I or even interwar way. They have this notion of using the economy and these structures to motivate correct behavior and instill notions of time. So, I mean, that's one way of looking at temporality. The other is, you know, the 5-year plan is temporality. That, you know, the way that French planning wants to be this middle ground between the US and the Soviet Union, right? They want a kind of a more flexible kind of planning, but that's still not an open market system. And the way they understand, I mean, they're making 5-year plans. Algeria is not staying French. It's very clear, you know, de Gaulle in 61 is talking about, 59 even uses the word self-determination. So there's also something interesting about the temporality of the plan and what that does politically for the end of colonization. And your first question, sorry, can you remind me? I got excited with the Bourdieu thing.
Sort of older religious categorizations. So, I mean, if we think about in the Ottoman period, ideas about religious belonging.
Yeah.
And then earlier colonial forms of that.
Yeah.
As they're sort of changing.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the period you're referring to, I was wondering about sort of the AOUMA and
right.
how sort of those conceptions of religious belonging surface or figure in this story.
Yeah. So for other contexts, one of the things that I've been trying to get my head around, I wouldn't publish on this anytime soon, but the ways that there is a racialization of sectarianism that comes out of Lebanon, for example, right? And I'm thinking of Elise Burton's recent book, right? That there is also not just racialization in discursive sense, but that Arab nationalism and certain forms of it did link up with notions of DNA and blood groups. So, on the one hand, I think that there are other histories that could be thought about in terms of Ottoman, but also, right, French Empire and other places. But perhaps because I'm so stuck on the racial formation and my Omi Winant is like my Bible, I'm always hesitant to go too far down this argument when I'm not able to make a solid case for the ins and outs. But yes, I do think that there are, and I'm also very cautious about, again, that everything becomes about race. I don't think that that's helpful in the region that we study. I think certain things can become about race, but to be careful that, one of my reservations, like I tried not to use the word racialize. One of my advisors, David Goldberg, used to just take it. Whenever I used something was racialized, you would just take a red pen and say, well, what does that mean? And what's the work that's doing? And what are the structures? In terms of the ulama, I mean, it's fascinating because they write a journal, Al-Marifa, where they're making a case for Islam and socialism, but they're making a case for Islam and socialism in a completely non-Marxist framework, right? In a way that you would see, Sabai's Al-Ishtirakiyat al-Islam, I'm forgetting the exact title of that book, but it's about dignity. It's about the amount of wealth. It's not about collective ownership of the means of production, but it's certainly an ideological touchstone that's being used by Ben Bella. And up until this point, most people studying Ben Bella and Al-Marifa or that configuration have basically said, it's just ideology, it's just window dressing. And I don't think so. I think there's a real intellectual project there to rethink this. And that doesn't mean that, Ben Bella is not an authoritarianism. This doesn't mean it's like some decolonial move, but I do think there's a real intellectual project there. And other people have written about the FLN as kind of method men, that, all they could do was think about independence and they didn't have any bandwidth or desire to theorize in more capacious terms. And so that chapter, which I had to go back and revise it to like make sure that I wasn't just being a Ben Bella kind of apologist, but I don't think that because we know how the story turned out, we should then not take seriously the intellectual project that was happening. And I think Al-Marifa is one of those moments.
I'll just take my authoritatively, I'm just going to ask. Yes, please. And also thank you for giving such a wonderful talk and for taking the time to answer all of these questions. I have, first of all, a comment that is just, I'm just surprised, I suppose, how malleable Algeria and the revolution is in terms of the ways that it's not quite this, not quite that, right? I mean, this is what you've been saying. It's not quite a pan-Arabist revolution. It's not quite an Islamic one. It's not quite a Robespierrean, whatever that means, revolution. And it's not quite a revolution. And then, as you said, I kept thinking, now Algerians are saying it's not quite independent. And so in terms of failure, there's a lot of discourse, and Malika Rahal's introduction is a little bit about this, about the idea that, well, Algeria failed its independence in many ways. And so I think there's a continuity of Algeria not fitting well within the numbers of various frames that people are trying to impose on it. In some ways, there are parallels with Palestine, I think, but I wanted to ask you about this. Is this almost like the Algerian Revolution is not a normative event? It's really just a frame, a hermeneutical frame, and people try to understand things through it and with it. So that's not a question. That's just if you wanted to elaborate. My question is whether the failure of the colonial project and the colonial space as a multicultural France ever shows up in the discourse of your planners. Like, I went to, as a North African person going to college in France, the number of times I've heard would have been so beautiful, Algeria as a multicultural project. It's too bad that we failed. And sometimes, however horrific that statement is, it was people who were critical of colonialism, but it seemed like they were critical of colonialism as a failed leftist utopia. I mean, it's a very weird idea, but I've heard that a lot, and I wonder if your planners ever speak about, say, the Constantine Plan or anything like that in terms of what we failed is a form of racial or cultural, hybridity. Maybe utopia is a strong word, or if that's maybe a very contemporary French move.
I think it's both very contemporary and very interwar, right? I mean, you have Camus, who is who everybody reads as the Mediterranean melting pot, and there's the whole École d'Alger that wants to say, this is not about biology and Roman superiority in kind of racial terms. It's about a cultural mélange. But of course, in that cultural mélange, the Arab Islamic element always has to be subordinate. I have a little bit of that in the book about how the Camus' spiritual grandfather, I think is how he calls himself, is also working on the Constantine Plan and in agriculture. And there are similarities to how he thinks about Algerian literature and how he is organizing economic markets in terms of the role of Arab producers or of Arabic literature. So I think and I think it's actually regional, looking around the Middle East and North Africa in the interwar period, Phoenicianism, Pharaonism, there's all of this kind of the whitening of the Mediterranean against an Arab nationalist threat. And so, the planners I study are not yet aware this is not possible, right? Because 62 hasn't happened yet. It's not clear that Europeans are going to have to leave. So they're very worried about the place of Europeans in Algeria post-independence. But they are not, they are less enticed by the kind of Camusian Mediterranean hybridity. They are, they're Sciences Po technocrats.
I'm too concerned with who owns the land and
Yeah. So, and I mean, the thing about Istiqlal and Algeria not fitting, it's something that I always find interesting, because Algeria is both the paradigmatic case of decolonization, right? Everybody reads Fanon, everybody, and yet it is so intensely not so many things, right? So there is a tension there about its paradigmatic and exceptional status. But I do think that's interesting to think through. I will say that I think when people are saying Istiqlal, they are not saying we didn't get independence. Like, I don't think anybody, I think it depends who you're saying it to, right? And you wouldn't go on France 24 and say, oh, you're right, Algeria really never got its independence. Like, no, these are really meaningful moments, and literacy rates and development rates and national sovereignty. I mean, this is important. But if you're going to a regime that is using decolonization as its legitimacy 60 years later, that's the moment to then strategically say, by the way, we didn't get exactly what we were promised.
Thank you for a very interesting talk, very rich. 4 quick questions. What are the impact of Les Cités from France on that? What's the impact of Nasser and his agrarian reforms in Egypt? Habib Bourguiba in Tunisia next door? And last but not least, how much do you read back, because of the rise of the FIS, that Islam became the other group and not other groups?
Nasser, Fils, and Nasser, Fils, and there's one more.
Bourguiba.
And Bourguiba. I mean, my take on Nasser is that while Nasser is hugely important to kind of the pan-Arab moment, when he comes to Algeria, I think it's 64, the visit is kind of a bust. Right, and there is a way in which Ben Bella and Nasser are competing to be, the Dunya model is not working so well, seen from the Algerian side. Continued into football. I'm not going to take this into football rivalries in the present, but and similarly, when Ben Bella goes to Egypt and is not able to make a speech in Fusha, it's also it's a strained. The Ben Bella Nasser thing is important in many ways, but it's also strained in many ways. I think these kinds of conversations, and so the book ends with Malik Ben Nabi, who is this Algerian intellectual who has been seen as a precursor to the Islamists. I have a different reading of him. It wasn't uncommon in the 60s to see Ben Nabi published next to Fanon in certain newspapers, right? And in today's consciousness, that's unthinkable because he's seen as a precursor to the FIS. But he actually writes, he has a book, Al-Muslim fil Alam al-Iqtisad, where the Muslim in the world of the economy, it was never translated into French and nobody talks about it, unlike some of his better known works, where he is wrestling with what does it mean to be a kind of Islamic modernist in kind of a Nahda style, and to be in the world of capitalism. So I think, and he also became a controversial figure during the Hirak recently. So I think so many of these conversations about Islam are difficult to have because people want to read back, right? The FIS, and Ben Bella people have said that Ben Bella is the reason that laïcité didn't work, because his populism was too Islamic and that he was a precursor to the FIS. So it's very easy to read back. I think that that is a completely spurious way of understanding this period, but it does make these conversations in Algeria difficult. Same goes for Tunisia. Sorry.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Miriam. I really enjoyed this. This is an open-ended question, so take what you kind of can or want. I'm interested in these method or epistemology questions. So I really took your point that you want to approach the Constantine Plan not as a kind of naive or simplistic act in the world that acts on Algeria, but instead step back and analyze what it presumes, right? What its assumptions are. And so it's about a deeper structure that it kind of reflects rather than as an event or act in the world. Or to the extent that it does act, it kind of reinstantiates, you know what I mean, or re-concretizes a deeper set of phenomena. And you also want to say then that the revolution doesn't kind of deeply rupture that you say it turns it on its head, but it's still you've got Islam and the economy conjugated together in this very deep, fundamental way. And the way you made that argument kind of seemed to presume that maybe they could be taken apart, or had he wanted to, and it just got me thinking about what is the role of the event here? You know what I mean? Like, can you actually act into these structures, or, what is their historicity? And thinking about the revolution as a kind of quintessential or classical political event, are the structures that you're tracing, how immune are they to this sort of eventfulness? Or how do you marry those different scales of analysis, the ones at which humans intend things and try to change things, and those deeper ones that of course obviously aren't within our power to change overnight?
That's a really important question. I don't know if I'm going to be able to do it justice. I think there's the imaginary of revolution as event, as year one, but I'm not sure that I have a good answer for how to conjugate the different scales at which change is happening, if that makes sense. And I'm not sure I can, I think what's interesting about revolution is the way it's invoked and the way it's used, rather than how revolutionary something is. There's, even now people are asking like, well, how revolutionary was 2011? What is a revolution in hindsight? And so I think what's interesting to me is the work that concept does, which is not to say that change doesn't happen over time, especially in terms of racial formations, but the moment of revolution is not the moment where the hierarchies and power structures and articulations of nationalism disappear. Yeah.
Just to, are you Natasha, by the way? Okay, that's what I thought. I was like, but just to combine Natasha and Itai's questions, because at this point in time, certainly these thinkers are also, and revolutionaries are also reading, even from Algeria, Said Qutb's Al-Islam wa al-Ahmadiyya, or are they? I don't know, that's a question. But so there's something happening with revolution as an opportunity inherently for comparison. It's not just us as the historians who are projecting onto, but also the contemporaries who are doing so. And how do we interpret that fact of that comparison, that Algerians under French colonial rule are thinking about Islam as a third way outside of both capitalism and a sort of Soviet socialism, based upon writings that are written from formerly British occupied Egypt, at a moment when, as you said, there are these specificities that we have to attend to, certainly. So, yeah.
Well, I think this has been a tremendous event. So thank you all for coming here, and thank you
so much for coming.